Good afternoon, everyone. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all here today. My name is Dr. Kate Santos, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the Science Division here at Longwood Gardens. And it is, again, my sincere pleasure to welcome you here today. I thought before we kick things off with today's speaker in our second installment of the Science series, I'd give you just a brief background of what we do here in science at Longwood Gardens. So our scientific endeavors are defined by a diligent, research-based pursuit that artfully innovates how we can celebrate and coexist with the natural world in order to ensure and depict its perpetuity for generations to come. Science informs the approach and practice for each of the 4 teams here to help bring to life our vision. And so we have 4 teams. Today, our speaker oversees our conservation, horticulture, and collections team. We also have land stewardship and ecology. This is the team that oversees the 750 acres of natural areas that surround the gardens, and many of you may have visited our forest walk or the meadow garden. Our floriculture production team, and so for any of you that were here last month and heard Diana Shull speak, this is the team that produces all of the beautiful seasonal plants that are installed in our gardens and in the conservatories. And last but certainly not least is our soils and compost team. And this is the team that's really responsible for the green material circularity that loops back through our gardens. So any material that's taken out of the gardens is then recirculated through production of compost or aged hardwood mulch. And so all of those materials are then used to create the beauty for the next year's gardens. The team is driven by a pursuit of knowledge where we become part of something better than ourselves, and we strive to leave the world better than how we found it, with the hope that our work inspires others to do the same. Our program has developed with 3 main tenets in mind: discovery, conservation, and innovation. And that starts with plant exploration, which Peter will talk with you more today, and really the exciting part of how things kick off in the option and opportunity for discovery. That moves to plant trials, seed banking, production, field evaluations, plant breeding and introductions, and production. So everything loops together in many different facets to bring to you what you experience in the gardens and in the world around us. So it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Peter Zale is the Associate Director of Conservation, Horticulture, and Plant Breeding. Peter received a Master's degree of Science and a doctorate in plant breeding and genetics from the Ohio State University. Peter is a truly remarkable scientist, botanist, and fearless plant explorer, which his stories today will later confirm. His team consists of several full-time research specialists, along with a team of seasonal part-time employees and invaluable volunteers. Their research plays an integral role in the global preservation of plants by bridging knowledge gaps and contributing to solutions to conserve plant species diversity throughout our natural lands, our garden displays, and the world around us. Peter recently returned from his second plant exploration trip to Tanzania and will be sharing his findings and experience with you here today. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for coming out to the gardens this afternoon and for coming to the presentation. I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing in tropical East Africa in the country of Tanzania. And I think before we really dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about what plant exploration is. And first I'll start with what it is at Longwood Gardens. And plant exploration is inspired by Longwood Gardens' mission. It represents our continual dedication to new plant discoveries, global collaborations, and plant conservation. Today it builds upon a legacy of Longwood explorers compelled to traverse the globe, the far reaches of the world, in order to learn about diversity, share its beauty, and contribute to efforts that will preserve it for generations to come. And so that's, our institutional mission. That's, how we start to define our plant exploration efforts. You might be wondering what exactly plant exploration exactly entails. And I will say that basically everything we do in plant exploration is built on partnerships. We can't go to Tanzania, we can't go to Japan, we can't even work here in Pennsylvania without the partners we have and the permits and the permissions and the friendships and the collaborations that we have with them. And then through these partnerships, we're able to do botanical surveys like I'm going to talk about today. We can participate in plant conservation related activities. We can help preserve cultural history in the places that we're going. And we can work with plants to help conserve genetic diversity of species themselves and within species. And we do this through horticulture. A lot of the work that we do is really rooted in horticulture. And in the end, we get a lot of great stories that we can tell at presentations like this and other venues around the world. And so today I'm going to talk about work in Tanzania. And this map illustrates all of the places that Longwood explorers have been over the last 60 years or so that this program has been in effect. And so you can see it's a pretty far-reaching program, and we've been everywhere, but this was the first venture we've really had into tropical East Africa and the first Longwood trip that we've ever had into Tanzania. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about plant exploration, but also how we link plant conservation. There's no doubt that every public garden, Longwood Gardens and any other public garden in our region or around the world, play an instrumental part in helping conserve plant diversity. And so today I want to talk about three facets of plant exploration. The really romantic side of plant exploration, which is going out into the field and going to exotic locations and looking for plants. And that's the thing that most people identify with plant exploration. But I also want to talk about what happens at night when you get back from the field and what happens after you get back from the trip, or even what happens before you leave the country that you're in, because really a lot of the work is really happening after you've been in the field. And so I want to try to give you an overview of what that's going to be like. And so in Tanzania, we have some basic goals that we're interested in. The first is we're really interested in this food called chikanda. And basically what it is people harvest the roots of these orchids, and I'll go into this a little bit, and they make food out of them. And chikanda is often likened to a vegetable sausage or orchid sausage, if you want to call it that. I have not personally had it. You can't actually get it in Tanzania. What happens is most of the orchids are harvested and sent to Zambia or other places where this product is made. So we've been doing a lot of work learning how to propagate orchids from here in Pennsylvania and all over the world, and we feel like the protocols we've developed, the technology we've developed, can be applied to helping learn how to farm these orchids in Tanzania. And so we're going there to work with government officials and other people to document occurrences of orchids, to make collections of seeds. We collect herbarium vouchers, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner there. So we collect the plants, we press them, we dry them, and then they go into a herbarium where they serve as a permanent record of the existence of that plant in the place where we found it. And then ultimately, we collect seeds and we do research to try to learn how to work with these orchids. And so I thought today I will basically just take you on a journey with me to some of the places that I went when I was back in Tanzania in November and December. And so this is what our logistics look like. This is what an itinerary looks like. So I was gone for about 24 days. And what we wanted to do, I was in Tanzania last January. I actually spoke at the Science Saturday series last year about the first trip. And then I went back because we wanted to visit some of the places we had been to, but also explore some new regions. And we do this basically, we have a Toyota Land Cruiser. So if you've ever been to Africa and gone on safari, we're basically using a safari vehicle. We have 4 team members. We work with officials from the herbarium in Tanzania, in Arusha, and another foundation as well. 24 days in the field, and people always want to know, what's the food like? And I can tell you, in Tanzania, there's not a ton of diversity, and we had chicken curry for dinner basically every night. And the interesting thing about it is, much like the field sites, you don't always know what to expect. Even if you go to the same place and the same chef cooks the food, you don't always get the same thing. And so a little bit of what that looks like. We get some other things too, and I put pizza there in double quotes because If you look at it there, I don't know how appetizing that looks, but it was memorable, but not for very good reasons, okay? And so, but just to give you an idea of what it's like to be there, we're really not going there for the food, okay? I mean, it's just part of the experience. Really what we're going there for is for diversity, right? We want to go to these different places where we can find our plants of interest and do a little bit of exploration. So today I'm going to take you with me to the Catulo Plateau, which is a very orchid-rich Afro-montane grassland in the southern part of the country. We're going to climb up Mount Runway, which is the highest peak in southern Tanzania, and then we're going to end at the Impanga Kipengere Reserve, where we found some of the most interesting plants of our trip. So in order to get to the southern highlands where we do a lot of our work, it takes a couple days to fly to Arusha, which is right at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro in the northern part of the country, right on the border with Kenya. And we basically have to start there and then drive all the way across the country, which, as you can see from the time on the map there, it takes a while. And so with plant exploration, there's often a lot of time in the car. And, you know, there's a lot of roadside botanizing. And, you know, the great thing about Tanzania and what most people often associate with the country is that the roadside fauna is quite a bit different from what, you know, we might have here in Pennsylvania in the mid-Atlantic. So we are able to, you know, make our way through one of the national parks known for its animal diversity, Tarangire National Park, and do a little bit of roadside botanizing and a little bit of animal viewing as well. And so elephants and giraffes and all of these things, I mean, it's kind of amazing to just be driving through these places and basically you feel like you're secluded in your vehicle. You're not allowed to get out, but you can see all these wonderful animals around. And so we make our way from sort of lower elevation at Arusha. We drive all the way across the country to the Highlands in the southern part of the country. And you go up very quickly. So it's very level, and then all of a sudden you start going up, 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 and you get these really dramatic views like you see here. And as soon as you cross over that ridge where we're standing on, we come to a place called the Catulo Plateau. And this is what it looks like. It doesn't look very African to me. It really looks more like a scene from Ireland or northern Scotland or something like that. These rolling hills with these lush, beautiful grasslands. And it, you know, honestly, from this image, it just looks like a sea of grass. But when you start walking through there and you really start to pay attention, you realize that this is actually an orchid paradise. And, you know, we often associate orchids as epiphytes that grow on tree limbs in the tropics and things like that. But many orchids also grow on the ground. And it just so happens that the Catulo Plateau has the highest diversity of terrestrial orchids or ground-growing orchids of anywhere in Tanzania. And you can see these jewel box-like orchids here that you see in the image are just absolutely incredible. And it's not just diversity in terms of number of species, but even looking within species. This one right here, Eulophia odontoglossa, is probably the most common orchid on the Catulo Plateau, but these are all the same plant. Right? And so these different color phases of the same form are really fascinating, you know, not only from the standpoint that there's probably different pollinators that pollinate them, but from a horticultural standpoint or a conservation standpoint, it's really quite interesting to see this diversity and think about, you know, oh, look at this orchid that looks like it's made out of black velvet would be incredible on display in our orchid room. So there's many reasons we go and do plant exploration, but the main reason that we're working in the Catulo Plateau is because these orchids, as I mentioned, are being poached. And any national park that you go to, the park rangers are carrying machine guns. And in most cases, all of the national parks in Tanzania have been designated for the animals. And so they carry these weapons as a precaution against that. It just so happens in this area, they're carrying it because the poaching pressure is so intensive. And you can see I'm holding in my hand there, that's what they're after, that orchid tuber they use to make the product called chikanda. So we went back to the Catulo Plateau because it's the most important orchid site in Tanzania, and there's lots of orchids for us to document and study, but there's a group of orchids that I was really interested in finding there, and there are these blue orchids that occur in tropical Africa that we're really interested in seeing. And now, you may have seen some of these blue orchids on display here at Longwood, and when it comes to horticulturist defining the color blue, there's a leap of faith there, right? These are really more purple than blue. And so, there's a lot of imagination in these names. And so, not to take anything away from these plants, but we were out on the Catulo plateau and we were looking at this plant, which is one of the most common plants throughout Tanzania, called Cycnium adonense. And this is actually a parasitic plant that parasitizes the roots of the different grasses that are growing there. And we were out taking these pictures and looking around, and I caught a little fleck of blue out of the corner of my eye, and we found this, which is called Disa baueri, the blue Disa of tropical Africa. And I think this might be about as close as it gets to blue when it comes to orchids. And this is a bizarre orchid because Tanzania has very pronounced wet and dry seasons. Most of the orchids that we're looking for are flowering when it's raining. This orchid likes to flower right at the interface of the dry and the wet season, so I feel like these flowers that we found were probably the last ones of the season. It probably bloomed a lot earlier, and we knew that because most of the plants that we found were in seed. And I don't post a lot of pictures of myself or like to use a lot of pictures of myself, but I was pretty excited to find this particular plant because it's just one of these things that almost is mythical, right? I mean, you see it in books and you see pictures of it online and things like that, but until you're standing there in front of it, it's almost hard to believe that it's real just because of the color of it and the fact that it's one of these orchids you never ever see in plant collections. And so we are really fortunate to find it. We are really excited. We are able to collect seeds. Now we have to learn how to grow it. The great thing about orchids is that they often grow in places where there's many other types of interesting plants. And of course, we're in Tanzania looking for orchids, but we're also looking for any other interesting types of plants. We take vouchers, herbarium specimens. We're collecting seeds of things to bring back to grow in horticulture. And orchids often grow with carnivorous plants, and if you've been to the New Jersey Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey, you've probably seen lots of carnivorous plants there. Some of these areas of the grasslands of the Catulo Plateau are very similar in appearance to habitats you might see in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, but they're totally different species. And so things like the Drosera and the Utricularia are both very interesting carnivorous plants. So we don't have a lot of time today, so as we kind of zoom back out from the Catulo Plateau, we have this landscape, and that cloud, that massive clouds in the distance is actually right underneath that is Mount Runway, and that's going to be our next stop. So you can see Mount Runway here. It's a big old mountain that's heavily eroded, and it's got sort of 3 different peaks to it. So our idea was to climb the highest peak of the mountain because we know at the top, at least in the past, there used to be 2 or 3 orchids up there that only grow on the top of the mountain. And southern Tanzania is kind of famous for these orchids that only grow right at the very peak of these remote southern mountains. And Runway is only about 40 miles as the crow flies from Catulo Plateau, but it couldn't be more different in a lot of ways. And what we soon learned about Runway is we have this incredible habitat diversity. It takes a long time to climb it. You have to start at low elevation and carefully work your way up, but where you start is tropical rainforest. And so this is very close to Lake Nyasa, which is the southwestern border of Tanzania, and so it gets high rainfall. And as you climb up the mountain, and part of the reason that botanists are so fascinated with mountains is because as you climb and the temperatures get cooler, you get these different bands of flora, right? So the plants change, and the plants that grow on the top are not the same as those that grow on the bottom. So we started in rainforest. We climbed through this sort of bamboo zone where there's just, basically a bamboo forest, and then the top is grassland, just like the Catulo Plateau. So we start in the rainforest, and one of the things I always love about going to these places is seeing familiar plants in the wild, right? Gloriosa superba is a plant well known in horticulture. Gloriosa lilies, they're not a true lily, but they look like a lily, and it's a plant that you might have grown. And it's interesting to see this. It grows along all roadsides and in all kinds of habitats in Tanzania, and everywhere you see it, it's a little bit variable. But I wanted to share this one because this beautiful scarlet flowered form really stood out against the green textures of the rainforest on Mount Runway. So to get to the peak of Runway, it takes about 3 days to get there. So we hiked part of the way up, and then we camped on the mountain for 4 nights. And so this is what our base camp looks like. And I've camped all around the world, and everywhere you go, it's kind of the same thing, right? You set up your camp, you know, maybe you eat a little bit, and then you just sit around the fire and chat. I don't speak Swahili like my counterparts did, but even just sitting there with them, listening to them, you can almost tell what they're talking about just based on the intonation of their voice. So, you know, again, part of the experience, just being at the camp. And what's interesting about the camp is that all around it are interesting plants. It was just high enough up that we started to get into see these other bands of flora, and we found these fascinating plants. 2 orchids, Epipactis africana, which is the tallest orchid in Africa, with Robert Sakawa, who is our guide in Tanzania, also one of the tallest people in Tanzania probably. So it gives you a scale of how tall that is. Calanthe sylvatica, which is a fascinating orchid because it grows in Tanzania, it grows in all of sub-Saharan Africa, it grows in India, it grows in China. It's one of the most widely distributed orchids in the world. And it's a little bit different everywhere you find it. And these particular forms on Runway are massive compared to things that you might find in South China or in Vietnam or places like that. And then there's other plants like this one, Impatiens austro-tanzanica. I had to go way back into the literature to even find out what this is because essentially no information about it exists. But you'll notice a lot of the plants that grow in these environments have these really bright orange or red flowers, and that's because of the rain. You know, there's a lot of overcast days, pollinators are out, plants want to make their presence known to these plants. As you climb up, you go through the bamboo thicket, you get to the grasslands, and you find orchids like this. One of my favorites, Soteria monodinum, these bright red orchids. And red is a very rare color in the orchid family. And so we have these plants that are of conservation concern, but they're also unique because of, you know, what they look like. And so they have potential for even being display plants here at a place like Longwood. So we climbed and climbed. Basically, you start at about 4 o'clock in the morning and you climb all day and you get to the top and you're exhausted and you're like, we've made it. But it's, you know, once you get there, you kind of forget all of that because you get that adrenaline rush and you're ready to look around. And you find really cool plants like Aloe nuttii, aloe species. Everybody probably knows aloe vera, but Tanzania has lots of different species of aloes. And there's way more species of aloe than just aloe vera. And so fascinating to find those plants. And you can see we got to the top, 2,891 meters in elevation. So not a super tall mountain, but it felt a lot taller than that after we climbed up there. And we got to the top, we were, you know, high-fiving, taking pictures, having a good time. And then the reality of field work in the rainy season in tropical Africa, you know, set in, and it just absolutely poured. Tanzania is the only place I've ever gone botanizing holding an umbrella because you just really never know, you know, when the rains are going to open up, but you can pretty much guarantee it's going to rain at least one time at some point during the day, every single day. So we were able to go to the top of Runway, we looked around, and what we quickly realized was that it's an expansive area. We knew this, and so this is a place we want to return to. We feel like there's a lot of work up there. We didn't find the endemic orchids. I'm not sure we were there at the right time, but what we're going to try to do is the next time that I go is set up another camp near the top of the mountain so that we can explore some of the vast stretches of these old volcanic peaks and see if we can find some more interesting plants. And so, you know, that's when it comes to this field work, it's hard to just go to these places one time and accomplish all your goals. You really need to go back and go there at different times of the year, and that's where you really learn things and have the opportunities to collect seeds and work with these different plants. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and go from the top of Mount Runway to a little bit lower elevation area to the Impanga Kipengere Reserve. And this is about 1,500 feet in elevation lower than the peak of Mount Runway. And you can see it's this sort of stunted landscape that's called Miombo Forest. And Miombo Forest is the most common ecosystem in Tanzania. It basically covers the entire country. And there's 2 or 3 species of trees that you can see here. They get about 20 to 30 feet tall, and they basically just dominate the landscape. But growing underneath these trees is this incredible layer of herbaceous plants. I mean, things that are unknown to science, things that are not known in horticulture, and I think the plant of the trip for us was found here. It's this plant right here called Siphonochilus, we think Ethiopica, which is actually related to ginger. And so you got this giant flower that appears at ground level growing on these termite mounds, and then it's followed by leaves that look kind of like a ginger plant in the end. And so this was something we're excited about because Siphonochilus, when you start looking at some of these plants in Tanzania, you realize that you're probably finding things that have never been described to science before. And so one of the outcomes of our exploration there is that we're probably going to be able to make a contribution to science by describing new species and working with our partners there to get that done. We're also interested in plants for the gardens. One of the most common plants in the Miombo forest is this one, Costa spectabilis. It sits flat on the ground. It's a It's a rosette about 6-8 inches in diameter with this huge yellow flower. And most of the time they have these green leaves. And I mean, they just carpet the hillsides. It's absolutely incredible. But in one place, we found these incredible red-leaved forms. And so it's not always just about finding a particular species, but also looking for the variations within them as well. So we are pretty excited to find this with the idea that, this needs to be brought into cultivation and, be in horticulture and, maybe one day be on display here at Longwood. Other interesting plants, Thunbergia grandiflora is a plant you can see here at Longwood. Thunbergias abound in Tanzania, and we found many, many kinds of them. My favorite was this one, this Thunbergia natalensis, with these really difficult to photograph, sort of deep purple-blue flowers. Absolutely incredible. Other things are more common, like this, the fire lily, or Scodoxus multiflorus. You can see here with this giant, beautiful inflorescence. Typically, it has normal green leaves. We found whole populations that had these almost black leaves that were emerging. And so again, it's a plant that's well known in horticulture and well loved, but we're finding these unique forms that, give us something a little bit different that we might even be able to use here at the gardens or just introduce to cultivation. So that kind of wraps up the field part of all this, right? Where we went to these different places, we're able to collect seeds, we're able to collect plants, we bring them back, what do we do with them? And so I want to talk a little bit about what we do to bring things back here to Longwood so we can do research, so we can put new plants on display, and sort of the work that goes into that, because it takes a lot to make that happen. So I'm going to talk about these two aspects here, seed and plant, material collection, and then this horticultural science. Even when you get things back here, that doesn't mean you can grow them, that doesn't mean the seeds will germinate. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and especially with something like orchids. If you're unfamiliar with orchid seeds, they have these tiny dust-like seeds, and in the wild, they would fall into the right place, and they not only need to be in the right habitat, but the right fungi need to be in the environment as well. And the fungi actually invade the seed, and the orchid seedling starts to grow and actually uses the fungus as a food source in the early stages of its life. And so to replicate this in culture can be really difficult. And we use our laboratory, which is right behind the conservatory here, to try to figure these things out. And so we're hoping that with these Chikonda orchids in Africa, we can work out the science behind growing them so that we can share with our partners there. We work with the Tanzania Sansevieria Foundation. Sansevieria, or mother-in-law's tongue, is a very commonly grown plant. It turns out that Tanzania is the center of diversity for the genus. People thought there were 15 or 20 species there. It turns out there's probably 50 or 60 or more. And so it's a very active area for describing new species and scientific discovery. And the Tanzania Sansevieria Foundation is working on that. And I'm mentioning that because as I've been visiting there and talking with them, they've gotten a little bit of orchid fever. And it turns out that they want to grow some orchids as well. So we're able to, in some cases, collect orchids and grow them on at the Tanzania Sansevieria Foundation. And what happens is Elias and Judea there are able to hand pollinate the orchids, basically acting as the pollinator would, pollinate the orchids, get the seeds to develop, and then they can send the seeds to us and we can work on them in our laboratory. And you can see by the sign there, they take the orchids very seriously. Even I wasn't allowed to touch them. And so they're very serious about that. They didn't have any signs like that on their Sansevieria. So we work with partners there to make sure that we are doing everything the way we should be doing it, but also to facilitate the flow of materials here to Longwood so that we can work on research, we can bring things into horticulture. And how do we do this? It takes a lot of work beforehand. What nobody ever talks about with plant exploration is that you're cleaning seeds at night for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. You're pressing herbarium specimens for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. And pressing herbarium specimens in the tropics is something else. You actually have to take a heater with you and put them over heat at night and carefully tend them. Otherwise, because of the heat and humidity, they just start to rot. So there's a lot that goes into it. And even before we ever leave, we work with the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service to make sure that we have the right permits to bring things in. So PPQ 587 is a permit to import plants. You can get a variation of that that just allows you to bring in seeds. And what they expect if they give you a permit is that you've been reading the 900+ page Plants for Planting manual to make sure that what you're collecting you can actually bring in, it's legal, and that there are no restrictions on it. And that information is constantly changing. So we have to make sure that we know that, because we don't want to bring in a potentially invasive species. We don't want to bring in any diseases that are not here. We don't want to do anything like that. So we follow this information very closely. Once you have all that, you get this beautiful yellow and green label, which basically routes it right to an inspection station, and they're all over the country. So you package everything, put that yellow and green label on there. Ours tend to go to Linden, New Jersey. The plant health inspectors there look at everything. They make sure that there's no pests, there's no insects, anything like that. And then once they release it, they send it to us. And in some exceptional cases, plants have to go into quarantine. And that is accomplished by going to Beltsville, Maryland, where they have a quarantine greenhouse. And quarantine can last anywhere from 2 months to 15 years, depending on what you've got. So it can be a very, very long process. But, you know, they're doing their due diligence, and they just want to make sure that, you know, all the plants we have here remain safe and healthy. So once the things get released from quarantine, we get them here. What do we do with them? We have to figure out how to germinate the seeds. We have to know if the seeds can be stored. Some seeds will last for decades or even centuries if you just put them in a refrigerator. Other seeds only are viable for a couple of weeks at a time. Do they need to be in our laboratory? And I see I've got that there twice. It's really important. And how long, you know, before they're displayed at the gardens, right? It could take years, you know, before something we bring in this time around could be on display here. And then we have, what are the research and development needs? So there's a lot that goes into, you know, what we do with this material once we get it here. And again, a big part of what we're doing is rooted in conservation. So we're very interested in helping the people in Tanzania understand more about their orchids, maybe even think about how they might be able to farm them or at least use them sustainably. And so that's what we're working on. We think that the answers to these questions are actually held in research that we've done learning how to propagate orchids here in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has about 60 different types of orchids that grow outside here. Most people don't even realize that. We have an incredibly rich orchid flora here. We've been working with them over the last 8 or 9 years to learn more about how we can use them as garden plants, how we can promote, you know, orchid conservation in the wild and various other things. And now we're applying that research to these orchids in Tanzania. So at this very moment, seeds from Tanzania are incubating in the lab behind the conservatory, and hopefully the next time we give one of these presentations, we can give you some positive updates about our progress with those. So I'm going to end there by just saying the mission of Longwood Gardens. Longwood Gardens is the living legacy of Pierre Dupont, bringing joy, inspiration to everyone through the beauty of nature, conservation, and learning. Thank you for coming. Now, I'm happy to answer questions for a little while. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know.
In germinating these seeds, do you have to duplicate the soil conditions, because it seems that they require certain minerals? So do you bring soil with you, or do you duplicate that soil?
Thank you. Yes. So the question was, when we're growing these plants that might have very specialized requirements, do we try to replicate the soil conditions, or do we even bring soil back? And the answer to bringing soil back is no. That is a big no-no. And you have to have a special permit to do that. And so we don't mess with that at all. And so one of the things, when you grow plants in cultivation, you often think, well, I need to replicate what might be happening in the wild. And that can be basic, it's often impossible to do. So we use, basic horticultural practices, basic potting mixes, containers, things like that, and try to see if the plants are adaptable to our production systems and, the way that we grow plants. And in most cases they are, and we might do a little finicking to try to figure that out, but we want to try to adapt them to what we're already doing and do it that way. It can get, when you take living soil or native soil, soil from the field, etc., and put it in a pot, plants in pots need to be watered a lot more than plants in the gardens, right? And so when you start watering that soil in a pot, it rapidly changes. The chemistry changes, the aeration changes, things change, and it can rapidly become toxic to the plant that you're trying to grow. So it's actually better to try to adapt, potting mixes that we already have to growing these plants than to try to replicate those conditions. That's a good question. Back here.
Professor, can animals and birds eat those plants?
Do animals and birds, the question is, do animals and birds eat any of the plants that I showed, or? Yes, and certainly it depends on where you're at, and they have issues with deer just like we have. They have this little species of deer called a dik-dik, and we saw lots of orchids where you could see, just like the white-tailed deer do to orchids here, they eat all the flowers, which is not good. But yeah, and it really depends on where you're at and different things. But yes, there is predation on plants from insects and animals. I think most of the plant-insect interactions are really more specific pollinator interactions more than the plants, being consumed by those insects. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, sorry.
Do you only bring seeds, or do you bring roots and tubers back? And the other question is about the seeds. Some seeds will only germinate if it's been through a certain animal's digestive tract.
Sure.
How do you accomplish that?
So the question is, do we only bring back seeds, or do we sometimes bring back plants? And then some seeds have very complicated interactions with wildlife, and do some seeds need a specific treatment, such as might have gone through the gut of an animal? And so yes, sometimes we're able to collect plants, especially when they're very abundant in the landscape, and we have a permit to be able to do that. We really prefer to bring back seeds because you can pack a lot of genetic diversity in a small packet of seeds, right? And so for some of the things that we grow, when you grow out a batch of seeds, you might get some that are more red, some that are less red, some that are white, and so we want to try to harness that diversity. That's not always possible to do if you're collecting plants. But the answer is yes, we do both, but we really try to collect seeds. And then, yes, some seeds, especially really hard seeds, need to be scarified, right? So we think of like peas, or many things in the pea family have these really hard seeds, and in order to get them to germinate in the wild, they might be consumed by something. They might, need a freeze-thaw period in order for that hard seed coat to be broken down. But in some cases, they need to be consumed and pass through the gut of an animal. And a very good example of that with orchids is vanilla, right? Everybody knows the vanilla bean, right? The vanilla bean is actually the fruit of the vanilla orchid, and that's taken and it's fermented, and that's how you get vanilla. But in the wild, if you look at the seeds of vanilla, they're very dark, they're almost black, they're melanized, and certain orchids have seeds like that. And the idea is that they probably need to pass through the gut of a bird or something like that in order for those dormancy factors, those factors in the seed coat that cause them prevent them from germinating. And so there's an old joke that in order to germinate vanilla seeds, you actually have to have a grouse in your laboratory. Feed the seeds to the grouse, let them pass through, reharvest the seeds, and then put them into the laboratory. We haven't done that yet, but I keep threatening that we might. Good question, thank you. Any others? Yep.
What is so special about the tuber that you said it's a food that's being poached? I just was curious a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and we want to know too, because I mean, you know, if you see one of these tubers, I mean, it's like a potato, and I mean, I think it might be processed in the same way, but I don't know, because we haven't had the Chikonda, we haven't seen it, we haven't really been able to talk to anyone that actually is involved in making it, because they're all in Zambia or even in Mozambique. But yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, you know, for research purposes, I hope one day we can try a little bit of it just to understand what it's all about. The thing about the Chikonda in Tanzania, it's illegal, right? Harvesting the orchids and selling them for Chikonda is illegal. So only on this last trip, you know, and again, this speaks to the value of going to these places again and again, were we able to, you know, talk to people and start to get a little bit of information about why they harvest and when they harvest, and they even have all these nicknames and all these other things. They don't call it Chikonda because the moment you say that, people just clam up and they don't want to talk about it. So not a very good answer, but to be determined. So hopefully next time we can start shedding more light on that. Yeah.
On some of the species that you're finding, you showed that one that had the red foliage that laid flat on the ground.
Yeah.
Something like that, do you geotag or locate it so you potentially could go back to that plant when it was actually in flower or producing seed?
Yes, very good question. So everything that we find, you know, if we collect it or if it's noteworthy, you know, we keep very accurate information. So everything gets GPSed. You know, we try to make sure that we can, if we need to, be able to go right back to that very spot. And so everything that we're doing, we create extensive field notes so that we have that as a record. You know, if we import, you know, seeds back here, we want to make sure that in our plant database, we have all of that information attached to those records so that, you know, people in the future working at Longwood, whether it's, you know, next year or 100 years from now, can understand as much about those plants as possible. So yes, that's a lot of the field work, is just taking the notes, making sure you have good GPS, you know, listing the associated species, right? Because in a lot of cases, things like orchids are sharing pollinators with other plants. So what are the other plants that are growing there that might be fostering these pollinators? And so we try to take very accurate records of everything that we see of interest or that we collect.
So you spoke about the potential long quarantine periods.
Yes.
What's the lifespan of the seeds? Like, would they last that long if they were quarantined for years, or would you just be out?
Some could. Seeds generally don't go into quarantine. It's usually the plants. And so like if we collect tubers or stem cuttings or things like that, they can go into quarantine for a very long time. So that's another reason we prefer to collect seeds over plants, because generally the seeds just go to the station. What they do is they actually put them into an X-ray machine of all things, and you can look inside the seed and see if there could be, you know, insect larvae or something living in there. Once they get the clean bill of health, generally they come right to us. The living plants are what tends to go into quarantine, and 15 years is really exceptional. It does happen. Usually it's more like 3 to 6 months. Okay. Yep. And some seeds, you know, one of the things I'm going to talk about in April is some efforts we're doing with collecting seeds and seed banking. Some seeds have the ability in the right conditions to last for centuries, and it's not unheard of for seeds to be able to last for decades. And so that's why, and I have one at home, like I have a little seed, you know, seed bank in my refrigerator, you know, vegetable seeds and all kinds of other things, because they'll last for years and years and years if you keep them in the right conditions. So yeah, so seeds are incredibly long-lived, but there are cases where seeds are recalcitrant, which means that they can't be dried down, they have to remain moist, and generally those have a much shorter viability than seeds that are dried down, and yeah, okay. Other questions?
Regarding seed banking,
Hang on one sec.
is Longwood participating worldwide with anyone else in this, or is this just your own initiative?
We are beginning to seed bank, and so the question is, are we participating in seed banking, and are we allied with anyone else? So you'll have to come back in April. I'm going to be talking about that on April 20th, but we are moving very seriously and into the world of seed banking. And we work very closely with, like our friends in Tanzania, we'll be banking seeds for them, but also right here in Pennsylvania, we have about 2,400 species of plants here in Pennsylvania, and many of them are rare. Some of them are, there's even one plant in Pennsylvania called the very hairy chickweed. It only grows in one place along the Octorero Creek, and that's it for the entire world. And so there's some really rare plants here. And what we want to do is working with partners in the Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Alliance and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. We're working with them to establish a seed bank to make conservation collections of seeds that can go into long-term storage and serve as a backup, should plants in the wild be affected by climate change or invasive species or any number of factors that are affecting the natural landscape. So come back in April. Okay.
I'm not sure I heard this correctly, but I thought I heard you say that sometimes, or that you may have found a different plant that hadn't been found before under that one tree.
Yeah.
And how does that, when that happens, how does it get documented? How does it get put out to the public to say, oh, we found a new plant?
Good question. So the question was, if you think you found a species that isn't known to science, so the potential for being a new species, how do you go about making sure that it's recognized? And so there's many ways we do that. We might do that right here in-house. So we do our own botanical research. We'll go, we'll do a literature search, try to find everything we can out about that plant, like that purple flower that I showed, Saphonochilus. If you look at the flora of tropical East Africa, which is about 60 years old now, which is the last time there really was a comprehensive treatment of all the plants in that region, there's only 6 species. Well, I can tell you on this last trip, we've probably found 6 different Saphonochilus that you cannot key out using that key. And so that's a good indicator, say, okay, it doesn't really match anything that's already known. We start to do a little bit more literature. In some cases, you might be able to find a guru or a world expert in that particular group of plants. So maybe you communicate with them and, start a conversation. And maybe, you give your information to them and they describe it. What we're hoping we can do is make that contribution to science. And so we can work with experts, we can work with our partners in Tanzania, but we can leverage our own scientific expertise to describe those species. And we would do that all in conjunction with Dr. Malel, who I showed holding the fire lily. She is a taxonomist and an ecologist by training, so we would work with her to make sure that those were recognized, because you can't conserve something if you don't know what it is, right? So that is, describing species and understanding diversity is foundational to conservation efforts. And so we're working on that. Like I mentioned with Sansevieria, there's all of these new species that have yet to be described, and there's so many of them. It's sort of a race to make sure that they get described, because their habitat is being destroyed faster than scientists can recognize them. So good question. There's a lot to it. Yeah.
Do you work with any groups that take these plants and test them for medicinal purposes?
We have not done that, and in fact, that's at Dr. Malel at the herbarium. That's one of her main areas of interest, and so I think within Tanzania, that's something they're doing more of. And these trips that we go on, because they're coming with us, they're able, they're storing all the herbarium specimens. They all go into their herbarium, but she's collecting plants as well. For instance, she's very interested in the genus aloe, right? Aloe vera is a well-known medicinal plant. There's hundreds of species of aloes in Africa, but not all of them have the same medicinal properties as aloe vera. So she's collecting aloes, and they're doing tests to see, what properties that they might have that could be used medicinally. But that's a big part of it. And when you're in, these places, one thing that is always amazing to me is that people, you go out to these rural places and these towns, and people know the plants, and they know the plants because that's where treatments and medicine and things come from, and so they know the uses of these plants, the historic uses, the cultural uses of the plants, and so you can learn a lot about that just by talking to local people. But that's something that Dr. Malel is really interested in. We're not doing it specifically, but we're at least tangential to it. Any others?
How do you talked about the partnerships, how do you either avoid or deal with any like conflicts that might come up over ownership of the seeds that you take back, or a credit for discoveries that you make, things like that? How is that shared? How is that managed?
Right. So the question is, how do we make sure that, there's a reciprocal exchange of information and ideas and seeds and things like that with the partners that we work with. And, most of this, what I didn't talk about in this presentation, I spent a significant amount of time last year just putting together research proposals, working through different government agencies. There were 3 different government agencies within Tanzania that we had to get permission from. We have an agreement basically that says we're allowed to collect the seeds, for research purposes. And, what most people are concerned about is commercialization, and that's not our goal. We're more interested in the science behind the things, the conservation, these sorts of things. But a lot of time goes into making sure that we have all the permissions in place before we ever collect a seed. So I went to Tanzania twice last year. I spent 7 weeks there. I went in January of 2023. I was hardly even allowed to touch a plant because, it was really just, we went over there to meet and greet. We went out to do some preliminary field work and, to really get the ball rolling on the permits. And it took all that time between when I got back in February up until even after I left to get those permits. So we want to make sure that everybody in Tanzania that needs to know about what we're doing knows, and that we have the proper permission in place. And that is a significant part of what I do. And it doesn't matter if that's in Tanzania or even here in Pennsylvania. We make sure that we have the permits and the permissions in place to be able to do all of this work so that everybody knows what is happening. And then in terms of, information sharing, like if we find a new species, that we want to describe, we'll work with our partners in Tanzania and other people through their network to make sure that everything we're doing is in line with the way they would do it, the way they want it done, and just reflective of, the fact that, those are their plants, and, that's, we're just there to help support what they're doing where we can, and to make sure that, again, we're doing everything the way we should.
Where do you get the funding for your trips and your research? Is it totally from the proceeds of the Longwood Gardens, or is there other funding?
Everything we do is funded through the gardens. Sorry, the question was, where do we get the funding to go on trips like this? And everything comes through the gardens.
I'm sorry, I was 5 minutes late. I don't know if you share how was that you were love struck by orchids?
So the question is, why do I love orchids? That's a tough one. Actually, it's not a tough one. It's kind of, so I became interested in trees when I was about 14 years old, and I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And in Cleveland, we have a very famous arboretum called the Holden Arboretum, or at least it used to be called the Holden Arboretum. And my family would take me there, and we would look at trees. Everything was about trees. And I remember walking out of the gardens, and there was a pamphlet with a picture of a yellow lady slipper orchid on it. And I picked it up and I looked at it, and I remember standing there thinking, like, orchids grow outside? Like I had gone down to Florida and visited my grandparents, and we would go to orchid nurseries and things like that, but I had no concept of hardy orchids. There's hundreds of species of orchids that grow where it's cold and seasonal, like the climate we have here. And I just, I always think about that pamphlet, and I think like, that really set me on the course, to study orchids. And when I was in college, I was planting native orchids and doing orchid propagation and stuff like that. And when I got to Longwood, because of the orchid collection here and the legacy of orchid cultivation here, we were really able to, it was a beautiful marriage of sort of personal interest and, professional interest. So it all started with just a little pamphlet and that little bit of information, that just sort of, at that time when I was very young, just kind of set the whole world on end. I think that's it, unless there's any more questions. Okay, thanks for coming.